Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Adrienne Gold Davis, and I want to welcome you to the third and final episode of this vital three-part Momentum Boost series about modern anti-Semitism and its rise on college campuses and indeed across the world. For those of you who might have missed the first two episodes of this series, we were all spellbound as we learned the steady and shocking trajectory of anti Semitic ideology, rhetoric, and persecution throughout the ages. And last week, we dealt with the subject of hatred in higher education. So let me remind you to make sure that you download our educational resource, which we prepared for you. It's spectacular. We've put it in the chat for you, and that helps supplement all of these discussions and give you something to hold on to. So tonight, we're moving from college campuses to the real world and understanding how anti-Semitism spreads. So as Dr. Fish said last week, college definitely is not Vegas. What happens on campus will never just stay on campus. And likewise, the rise in anti-Semitism in higher education will not remain on campus either. So we're going to explore the many ways in which anti-Semitism follows college students out into that real world and then enters mainstream politics, social media, religious institutions, and your community. So we are very grateful to the Russell Berry Foundation for sponsoring this vital series. And now to introduce our fantastic guest. Dr. Rachel Fish is the founding executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism. She was also the executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University, where she helped train the next generation of academics in the field of Israel studies. She's taught at Brandeis University, Harvard University, UMass Amherst, and in adult Jewish education programs. She is the co-editor, along with Ilan Tron, of the book Essential Israel, Essays for the 21st Century. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Fish.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening with all of you from Momentum. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the Russell Berry Foundation. And please do look at the educational resource. There are lots of materials that supplement from the first, the second, and then of course to tonight's session. So I'm going to share my screen in order to be able to, again, share the presentation with all of you. And I want to talk about exactly what was just mentioned, the ways in which the conversation from last week, where we discussed the various roots of the phenomena of delegitimization towards Jews, and specifically Jews identifying with the state of Israel, and how these ideas not only remain within the university, but expand into the larger mainstream discourse and enters, whether it's politics, media, campaigns for social justice, in order to be able to understand how these ideas enter that conversation, and then ways in which we can think about our role and the Jewish community response to engage with it. So last week we discussed some of these roots of the phenomena, which I'm not going to go through again, but I just wanted to remind all of you, these are ideas that have had a history for decades of creating and influencing the intellectual framing. So these ideas, and it's not just about Israel, but often they relate to Israel or can be leveraged and manipulated for a purpose that suggests that Israel is a white imperialist outpost in the region of the Middle East, and that those who are living in that territory are coming from a Western orientation and impose a Western lens onto the native indigenous peoples in the region, of which Jews are not considered to be, which we obviously know negates a very important part of Jewish history and the idea of Jews being aboriginal to this territory. And it also negates Jews coming from the Mizrach, right? The parts of the Arab world, the East and North Africa. So all of these ideas we see do not only stay in the university, but enter into a conversation that goes beyond. And one of the first kind of accusations or suggestions you will often hear is that I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. So I want us to unpack that for just a moment. Now, we know that anti-Zionism, meaning those who do not agree with the idea of political Zionism as a response to the Jewish problems of anti-Semitism and the problems of assimilation, has always been a Jewish response. It has been a Jewish response before the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And it was a way for those Jews who were living primarily in Europe to say, we don't think that Zionism is the answer to these Jewish problems, the problems of persecution and the problems of assimilation. And there were individuals who said there are other ways to engage with the reality without it being a political solution of moving Jews to a particular territory and having self-determination. So in some ways, anti-Zionism has to be understood within the context of Jewish history, in the context of the Jewish political experience. And we have to understand that it's not unreasonable for Jews to hold positions that are anti-Zionist from a historical framework. We also know that there are some, even today, who live within Israel who continue to hold an anti-Zionist position. And that exists because it's a framework that suggests you can't fully accept a sovereignty, the state of Israel, in the capacity that it currently exists until you have reached a point in which the Messiah has come. So this anti-Zionist position is coming from a place in which it's a response because Zionism and traditional forms of some ways in which Judaism presents itself can be in a battle with one another. So that does exist as well. But what I want to say very clearly is the kind of anti-Zionism that we see on campus, the kind of anti-Zionism that we see playing out in the mainstream frameworks that we're going to discuss, they don't take that into consideration. The anti-Zionism that they are putting forth is an anti-Zionism that is arguing that Jews do not have a right to determine their own collective identity and their desires for self-determination and political will. So when someone says, I'm an anti-Zionist, that's actually coming from a position that I would argue, which is much more of an anti-Semitic position, but it's politically correct these days to hide behind the guise of anti-Zionism, and it's deemed not to be an inappropriate kind of response. And there are many who are reluctant to call anti-Zionism anti-Semitism. Now, within the progressive discourse, and I'm specifically focusing on the progressive discourse within much of this conversation, because this is how we see the ways in which this part of the Israel conversation has a situation in which it cannot fully be shared and openly, and there is an exclusion of Jews. So let's talk about this a little bit. Within the progressive discourse, there is truly a seduction of multiculturalism. And we know multiculturalism has its benefits. But in the intersectional discourse that we're about to talk about, and I'm going to unpack in just a minute, what we see very often is an unhealthy sense of competing forms of victimization. We see false binaries that are created, these dichotomies, in which people get firmly entrenched in certain black and white positions and cannot hold a middle space. And we also see that there's a lack of a sense of what it means for Jews to be part of a tribe, to be part of a collective. That notion is not understood because Jews are often thought of as only a confessional identity, as a religious identity, which means that they don't have the characteristics of being a people. And this ultimately undermines Jewish continuity. Now, what is intersectionality? It's a term that you hear very often today. And so I thought it was important to put it in its original context so that we can see how it has transformed over time and been leveraged by different groups at different points in time. So just to give a short understanding of context, the term intersectionality is coined in 1989 by a law professor, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who teaches at Columbia University. And what she was looking at specifically was thinking about how the issues of race, class, and gender, as well as other individual characteristics, literally intersect with one another and overlap. So think about a Venn diagram. And when she is framing intersectionality, it's actually, again, when she's looking at these different court cases, and they're trying to understand why it is that Black women at General Motors are being fired at a much higher rate than other employees. And when she brings that court case and looks at that court case into the legal framework, she says you can't just look at this based upon that these were women. And you also just can't look at it that these were based on people's racial identity, that they're African American, but that together these experiences of being Black and female impact their role in this larger conversation. So that is the framework you need to think of when you originally hear the term intersectionality. And Kimberly Crenshaw and some of her colleagues are disputing the legal position that had been put forth, which they claimed was a false consensus, where they said that discrimination and racism, they were arguing against, because the consensus position had been that if you just understood that these laws were irrational that were in place, and you got rid of that irrational bias, then ultimately the legal aspect and the socioeconomic order could revert to being completely neutral, completely benign, and then justice would prevail. Why this matters is because Crenshaw and her colleagues say, wait a minute, there was never this period of the law being completely neutral. Socioeconomics were never completely neutral, and they were never completely benign. So they would argue that the Civil Rights Act of 1965 didn't actually end racism as we know it, that racism was not an aberration, that it is a multi-century phenomena that has impacted the origins of this country in America, and that legislative action alone cannot correct for the problems of racism. And ultimately, racism and the discriminations that persist because of racism will create long-term structures. And these long-term structures are put in place by systems that allow for white dominance to be the reigning paradigm. And she writes all of this in her well-known paper, which is called Demarginaling the Intersection of Race and Sex. At the point in time in which she writes all of these ideas in 1989, the majority of people are not paying attention to this term intersectionality. It is not something that is picked up. It is not utilized within even the academic discourse, even though it is used in some of the legal frameworks. It's really not until the period of about 2017 when we really start to hear a lot about intersectionality. You heard about it a little before that, but not much. And it goes mainstream with the Women's March in 2017. And you begin to hear the organizers of the Women's March say specifically that these intersecting identities that women have are meant to allow us to understand the multitude of ways in which women and other groups are impacted, and that these are social justice issues and human rights issues. So the question then becomes, what happens when we move from an intersectionality definition, as Crenshaw was posing it, to one in which it is becoming much more prescriptive, the way in which the Women's March organizers are suggesting? And what I would say is that the politics of intersectionality and the way I have observed personally the politics play out on the campus space and into many of the more progressive movement campaigns, initiatives, and politics, we begin to see identity politics in which intersectionality becomes a very important part of that identity politics. And there's an inverse of a hierarchy that is being suggested, which some would articulate as being the onset of oppression Olympics, meaning there's a competition around who can be the most victimized. And based upon that victimization, one is kind of being championed in ways that others would not be. And in this equation, let's be very clear, the one who was moved to the bottom of that sort of totem pole or hierarchy is the white, straight male. Every other group will be above that, but there is a competition to see who can be oppressed by others in order to be at the top of that hierarchy. So we talked about in the Women's March, two of the leaders themselves, Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory, were not only using their identity politics and the way they used intersectionality. Tamika was talking about being an African-American woman, Linda Sarsour, a Muslim woman, but they also used the intersectional politics to exclude others from that conversation. Similarly, there's an exclusion of Jews from the conversation when it comes to the Dyke March, also in 2017, based in Chicago. And this march in particular, when Jews walk into the march wearing their rainbow flags, their rainbow pride shirts, and a Magen David, a Star of David on them, that flag is equated to being the equivalent to a swastika flag from the time of the Nazis or a Confederacy flag. And these Jewish lesbians, most of them lesbians, who came to the march, who were told, you are not to be part of this march, you are excluded from it because this flag connotes power and it connotes colonialism and it suggests oppression. And by you holding it, you are an oppressor. So this becomes part of the conversation. So how does this overall impact the Jewish community? As we talked about on the very first session, if you recall, the way in which the discourse works coming from this progressive space is that Jews are deemed in this case to be white and to be privileged. So it means that any Jew who is not understood to be white doesn't fit into this category. There's an assumption that Jews all come from a higher socioeconomic class, and this is coded language to suggest that Jews are colonialists, Rothschilds, oppressors. Now remember, if you think about the way in which white supremacy thinks of Jews, Jews are always the other, and Jews will never be white. Jews can never achieve that purity of ethnicity the way white can in America or Aryans can in Germany. So again, you see, you'd say, in Hebrew, it's hafuch, it's upside down, but that's how it is in terms of the left and then the right. And in this case, in terms of the progressive space, you even will hear accusations that Jews benefit from white supremacy. Now, it's not the same understanding of white supremacy the way we understand it in terms of white supremacy who marched, white supremacists who marched and walked into the Capitol and rushed the Capitol on January 6th during the January 6th insurrection. It's the idea that as a system that benefits individuals who appear white enough or adjacent to whiteness, ultimately are institutionalizing racism, and Jews are seen to be part of that system and benefiting from that system, rather than confronting that system in order to create the change that is desired by individuals of communities of color. So what is happening in this process, and it's complicated to explain, but you can see it when it plays out, is that ultimately this framework that has now been imposed on intersectionality, even if it's not the way Crenshaw intended it, unwittingly at best and knowingly at worst, negates Jewish vulnerability. It suggests and undermines that you cannot have bipartisan support of Israel. It doesn't allow Jews to do what they have done for so long in all different types of social justice movements, which is to engage in building broad coalitions, whether it was with the feminist movement, whether if it was for the civil rights movement for African Americans in this country, whether it was for fighting apartheid in South Africa. This does not allow for the building of those allyships in order to generate the necessary change where Jews can be part of that conversation and engaged in meaningful ways. It also dissolves that middle ground that I was talking about and entrenches people firmly in these very politicized black and white positions that create a very real bifurcation and doesn't allow someone to hold the position that you can both be an ally, you can engage in trying to create change and building bridges, while also having your own vulnerabilities as a community. And so the Jews, therefore, have to find a way in order to navigate that. But too often, the movement suggests, whichever movement it may be, whether it's the women's movement, LGBTQ plus movement, whether it's dealing with issues around race, the movement suggests that in order to be part of that movement, it is incumbent upon Jews to sublimate their particularism as Jews, to sublimate their relationship with Israel as Zionists in order to elevate and prioritize the other. Now, we know that, as we have said before, you need to be both inward for your own and outward for others. That is the beauty of Judaism. This is what Rabbi Hillel talks about. We know that you cannot just be for your own, you must be for everyone also. So it's that healthy tension between universalism and particularism. But this equation that's being forced upon Jews, particularly young people who want to be parts of movements that require social change, that demand that we change the system, do not understand what is being asked of them or the long-term implications that has on their own identity and their own community. The other piece I would just add to this is that much of the movements today are seeking revolutionary change, and they do not want to settle for the incremental approach that is often required in order to build momentum to long-term create that revolutionary change. Now, we know that's a tactical question, but what is happening in this case is that when Jews are trying to take the incremental approach, they are seen ultimately as being obstructionist and not engaging more passionately and in a more devoted way to meet the urgency of the moment and demand that revolutionary approach. And so this is a real tension that exists between the Jews who are part of some of these movements and the way in which centrist organizations like Jewish Community Relations Councils are attempting to engage in this work versus the organizations that are coming from more extreme positions from left of center groups. Now, as I said before, this has a direct impact on the exclusion of Jews within these spaces, whether it's the Dyke March, the Women's March, the Movement for Black Lives. And ultimately, Jews' allyship has been called into question, and it can result in some of the anti-Semitic tropes re-emerging. So I showed you this image from the first meeting that we had together. And let me remind you again what this image is connoting. This is an image of an Israeli policeman with his arm around an American policeman. The Israeli policeman has his knee on the neck of a Palestinian, and the white American policeman has his knee on the neck of an African American, obviously resembling what happened with George Floyd. This is specifically, though, not just about the depiction of both America and Israelis being white individuals of European descent, harming individuals of people of color, but this is part of a campaign specifically organized called the Deadly Exchange, which suggests that law enforcement from America should no longer be allowed to engage in professional development trips in order to go to Israel to learn from law enforcement in Israel, because law enforcement in Israel is supposedly teaching American law enforcement professionals in America how to engage in racial profiling and how to harm communities of color. This has led to an entire initiative that not just Black Lives Matter has been involved in, but also Jewish Voices for Peace, a very left of center organization, I would say very far left, often outside of the tent of many within the Jewish communal institutions, that suggests that it is necessary to not just defund the police, but to end relationships with Israel for the purpose of recognizing that Israel is actually teaching these lessons, teaching these kinds of approaches to American law enforcement at the detriment of individuals in this country who are of color. This is a massive campaign that is reaching college campuses across the country. It not only has reached law enforcement on college campuses, it has also reached local police stations in which local municipalities have led initiatives specifically to stop having local law enforcement engage in these professional development initiatives that organizations like the American Jewish Committee, that the Anti-Defamation League, that certain Jewish community relations councils have sponsored for quite a long period of time. You also have claims against Israel, separate from this, around pinkwashing. This is the idea that Israel pinkwashes to negate the fact that Israel is a society that embraces the LGBTQ plus communities. And what you will see within some, like we saw at the Dyke March, like we see in many LGBTQ plus movements and also larger policy initiatives, is that when Israel talks about embracing the LGBTQ plus community, talks about the way in which it's proud of its engagement with Pride Month in, for the LGBTQ plus community, this is deemed to be a way to draw attention away from the challenges Israel faces as a society towards the Palestinians. And these claims then are used to suggest that Israel just tries to leverage their support of the LGBTQ plus community as a distraction from all of these other issues. So again, this is how we see in these spaces a pushing and a distancing that is taking place around Jewish allyship, Jewish engagement, unless the Jew is willing to say, I distance myself from Zionism and I do not want to engage with Israel. Then that individual is welcomed, like we saw from Jewish Voices for Peace. So how should the Jewish community engage in these spaces, knowing the complexity around it? So a few things. One, we have to figure out how to mobilize the Jewish community to actually talk about these issues in a serious and significant and substantial way, the way we are this evening. How do we label it? How do we define what's happening? And then create a space in which we can discuss it without necessarily everyone falling in the same political position, but at least being willing to recognize that this is a reality that is happening, that is not just about what's happening in elite classrooms at elite universities within certain cities. We need a much more nuanced conversation about this. And this has to be both from our Jewish leadership to the partners that we seek to engage with. And while we are looking to build those partnerships and create the change and serve as allies, we as individuals have to have the confidence to talk about both being allies in relationship to create the change that we know is needed in our society, while simultaneously recognizing and helping our partners with whom we want to engage recognize that there is Jewish vulnerability, that Jewish vulnerability is real. It is a part not only of the lived experience, the historical experience, but it is part of the reality for many Jews today, not just based upon how you look, not just based upon where you may stand politically, and not just based upon your relationship with the state of Israel, but all of that needs to be part of the conversation. And then I talked about, but I didn't get to go into depth, the cultivation of brave spaces. And I really would argue that this is one of the most challenging things that we need to do as a society writ large, knowing that we live in a more politically divisive society than we have seen in quite a long time, that identity politics is not actually helping us engage in really building long-term sustainable relationships. And we're not taking the time to really understand and build the muscle of compassion to understand other individuals' experiences, communities who have had a historical reality of bias and discrimination and prejudice. And at the same time, while listening and hearing that, understanding that it doesn't negate our own experience. So, how we engage with differences, and these conversations have to happen with young children on the car rides home, based upon the literature and the books that you're reading to your kids. And then, of course, finding ways to continuously hone those critical thinking skills, practice civil discourse, recognize that we both have rights and responsibilities, that it's going to be a hard and challenging conversation, that there are going to be moments in these movements in which we feel uncomfortable. So when do we know when that discomfort is productive, and when does it become unproductive? And we have to recognize there may need to be a change in the way we understand engaging with some of these movements. Having the moral courage to listen, to hear what people are saying, and also continue to speak up on behalf of the identity that we hold so dear to ourselves, which is our Jewish identity. So that is the framework that I wanted to present this evening in terms of how these ideas have entered the mainstream, how these initiatives do have an impact on movements that we care about, on communities that we care about, and at the same time, recognize that while we don't want to abandon these important initiatives, we also have to remain true to what we care about so deeply and who we are as a people. So I'm happy to take any comments, questions that you may have.
Oh, honey. Another uplifting evening with Dr. Rachel Fish.
That's right. That's
Listen,
right.
I have a lot of questions, and so does the audience. I want to begin off topic, but not. I want to talk about the verdict around Sarah Halimi's murder in France. I want to ask you why you think that any nascent attempts to protest really fell flat around the world.
It's a great question.
What is it about us?
So I do think in France it didn't fall short. I think in France 25,000 strong were present,
Right.
and major government officials, from the mayors to high-ranking individuals, made a statement and were aware of the challenge that the decision of the court presented long term. The question of why in parts of America there wasn't the same momentum and galvanization in order to create that sense of urgency is, I think that one, unfortunately, we have grown accustomed in many ways to Jewish blood being spilled. And it doesn't anger us enough the way it ought to. And we are more willing to accept it than to actually publicly denounce it. And that's a problem for us, because it means that we've internalized in some ways thinking that we should be accommodationist in this regard rather than morally outraged. So I think that's a piece of it. The other piece I would say is that where were our allies? Many of us were involved in the Women's March. Many of us were involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. Many of us have been involved in LGBTQ plus movements for all good reasons. And where were those allies when we need them? Did we call them? Did we not call them? If we didn't call them, why not? Why didn't we make the same demand?
Right.
And I think that's part of that honest conversation that we need to start having. And we need to have it with ourselves and we need to have it with our leaders, because to expect that anything is going to change if we don't have those conversations, that's just absurd.
It just seems to me that our statute of limitations has run out post-Holocaust about having any empathy for, the Jewish position. And of course, we know that in every generation, they rise up against us. It's not just historical, it's biblical. This is what we were told. Having said that, we don't have to take it lying down. And I don't understand what it is that makes us so embarrassed to stand for ourselves and to demand from others. There's something psychologically not quite right there.
Well, I'm going to say something for an American context, at least. It may not work for other countries, but for an American context, it works, which is when I said that Jews are thought of as a religious group, as a confessional identity, in America, that is the case, right? We might as well be like any other religious stream, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, right? We don't in America understand the concept of peoplehood
Right.
as Americans. It's a foreign concept. Now, particularly, you don't have that concept within Christianity, all the more so. That's not a concept. You do within Islam, you do within Judaism. Just bear with me for a second where this is going.
Yeah.
Where this is going is that when you say, what has happened, why are Jews not understood in some ways as being a people who have faced this persecution? Jews are now seen not as a vulnerable people, as a vulnerable minority, right? They are seen as a religious community that expresses itself. And that religious community is seen as being, for the most part in the American context, a people that look white and a people that hold privilege. Now, that's not necessarily the case at all.
No.
We know that there are people who are not white looking, who did not come from Europe, who came from other parts of the world. We know that not every Jew is quote unquote financially privileged, does not have the socioeconomic status that is deemed to be what all Jews have. And yet that is sort of the framework, that is the idea that is placed upon Jews. Now I'll say one more thing. As Reform Judaism has grown, and I'm not saying anything negative about Reform Judaism, but I want to highlight that as Reform Judaism has grown in the American context, there has been a hyper focus on the concept of tikkun olam.
Right.
Now, we care deeply about tikkun olam as a people, but the hyper focus has meant for many Jews, even in understanding the value of tikkun olam, that it's tikkun olam always for the other, not for yourself.
Yeah.
And so what that means then is when something horrible happens within the Jewish community, it's part of the reason why you don't see Jews feeling that moral outrage, because in some ways we say, it was bound to happen, right? Or, well, it's still not as bad as what's happening to X community. And it creates, that's that oppression Olympics I'm talking about.
Oh yeah, I've been in the motherhood Olympics, so I know the paradigm you're talking about, right? Let me ask you this. You talked about incremental changes versus, these dramatic turnarounds. Incrementally, what do you suggest? And somebody has just written in, and I want to make sure I get to it. How do I discuss the current political view of the conservative Israeli government settlements in Gaza? My son believes that Israel is the aggressor in this dispute. He feels that the fact that Israel has a national religion makes them less tolerant as well.
There is no settlements in the Gaza.
So, in terms of incremental, I want to first answer that. In terms of that incremental conversation, I think there are real things that each of us can do on a regular basis. And they are real and they are meaningful. And some are for internally, for ourselves, for our own community, and some are externally. We have to be engaged in understanding other communities, always, right?
Sure.
If we're only insular, that is not the world we live in. It is not healthy. And if we aren't showing up for people who are in need, we know that that's also what is demanded of us. We talked about this in the first session, right? We know what it means to be a stranger in a strange land, what it means to be the ger. And if we don't understand what the ger is experiencing, then that's on us to learn. If you think about the times in which Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Joachim Prinz were fighting and walking with their feet and said, these are our prayers. Our feet are praying as we walk to fight civil rights. It's because they understood from their own experience of what happened in Nazi Germany, that Jews could not remain silent during the period of Jim Crow, that Jews had to stand up for people who were being prejudiced, who we were being prejudiced against. That's clearly a Jewish value. That is who we are. But that doesn't happen overnight. That happens by building relationships with people, not by building an abstract concept that seems untouchable and as an idea. And if you question the ideology, you're shunned as part of being part of the problem. So we have to build serious relationships with individuals. And that means people who disagree with you on Israel sometimes,
right?
Politically. Not someone I'm saying who says Israel has no right to exist, but maybe politically they don't feel the same. Okay. Most Israelis that you spend time with don't feel the same. That's fine. And we have to be comfortable with that being fine. We also have to recognize that we have to ask the difficult questions around these ideologies. And we can't allow the silencing and the questioning to be the force that ultimately propels people into just acceptance. That is highly problematic.
Yes, it is.
So we have to have the critical thinking skills to say, listen, I hear what you're saying. I agree with you. This is problematic. But this position has a variety of reasons that one may be feeling this position, and it shouldn't be assumed it's already because of another reason. So you have to break it down.
Of course, but you're going to be shouted down in most public forums for that, or, booed out of the room. This is, it almost needs to be a campaign that, that we mount internationally.
Well, that's right. Listen, what's the biggest sin today? The biggest sin today?
To be a white man.
That's definitely part of it. And to be racist.
Right.
Or to support anything that is deemed by somebody to be racist.
Right.
So guess what? In this equation, and we saw it. What did Human Rights Watch publish this week? They needed 213 pages to tell the world that Israel is a racist apartheid state. Don't forget, there was another organization, a Jewish organization that did that in January, a Jewish Israeli organization.
Yes, I know.
Right? So now we have a non-Jewish organization that pretends to say it's Human Rights Watch. But mind you, I didn't hear them say anything about Iran being elected to the highest UN Commission on Women's Rights Issues. Hello. That's right. And then, right, we also have Jews doing this. So it's very challenging.
We have internalized a sense that we can only focus outside of ourselves. And it worries me because this kind of everyone else and not us usually precludes enormous periods of anti-Semitism. I mean, if you look at Germany prior to the war, we are Germans first. We pray facing Berlin. Our prayer books are not in Hebrew. When we try to assimilate, anti-Semitism comes to tell us to get out of the mainstream. When we refuse to assimilate, we are considered, isolationists and tribal. There doesn't seem to be any answer. The young woman who talked about her son's position. I mean, this is a position I've heard from my own nieces and nephews as well.
Sure.
And yet there really are no settlements there anymore. I mean,
That's
we've
right.
dismantled them.
That's right. I mean, in Gaza, there are literally zero Jewish. It's
It's
Right? It's free of Jews,
Yeah.
right? And yes, so the only presence you have is when there's a security threat and Israel has to go into Gaza. That's the only time there's a Jewish presence in Gaza.
That's right.
Now there, of course, is a Jewish presence in the West Bank.
Okay, let's talk about the West Bank then for a minute.
Right. So first of all, if we want to talk about the West Bank, we have to remember the West Bank, those Palestinians who live in the West Bank are not Israeli citizens. They are not. Jews who live in the West Bank are Israeli citizens. They are protected under Israeli law.
Okay.
Israeli military law controls the areas A and B. Remember, during the Oslo period, the West Bank got divided into areas A, B, and C. So if you look at a map, that's why. And areas A are all Palestinian. I'm sorry. So yeah, area A is all Palestinian, no Jewish control. Area B and C have an Israeli presence, Jewish control. B is what you're going to see settlements. You're going to see a lot of settlements. And what happens is that it's Israeli military control. It is not civil control because it is a military presence. Israel has not annexed the West Bank. It is still considered to be something not Israel.
Okay.
But this is what poses the challenge. Remember, in 1967, armies from surrounding Arab countries come and attack Israel. Israel did engage in a preemptive strike, but only because Nasser had blocked the Straits of Tiran. So Israel engaged in that preemptive strike, which is considered by any political scientist acceptable because it's part of the just war theory.
Sure.
They knew that war was going to happen. So you protect your citizens in that case. But Israel was able to control additional territory from that war experience. East Jerusalem was now in Israeli control.
Right.
The Gaza Strip and Sinai, now under Israeli control. The area of the Golan Heights, now under Israeli control. West Bank, which had been under Jordanian control, now under Israeli control. That changes the contours of the conversation dramatically. Now Israel controls much more territory than it ever controlled in its history. On the 7th day of the 6-day war, right? War is over. You already had individuals like David Ben-Gurion, who was not prime minister at the time, but he was still deeply respected.
Right.
You had David Ben-Gurion. You had Professor Yeshayahu Leibovitz, well-known academic, Torah Talmud scholar, mathematician, who were already saying, from very different political perspectives, Israel needs to return the territory. So why I say that is not to make a political statement. I say it to show that on the 7th day of the 6-day war, the conversation was already happening in Israel.
Huh.
The conversation was happening when a society was still mourning the loss of its loved ones for defending this country. The conversation was happening because these individuals said, we are concerned about what it will mean for Israel to be a democracy if it controls this territory and controls another people. My point is that within Israel, this conversation has been alive since that 7th day. There are some who said you need to hold that territory for as long as possible because the more territory you have, the safer Israel will be. There were others who said give it back as quickly as possible. It will not make Israel more safe. But that is a real debate that continues today.
Yeah, it is.
And there's no easy answer to it. And so my question always is, if there are Israelis who are willing to understand that that's a real debate that continues today, then why is it so hard for American Jews to understand that holding power, real power, that defending your own citizenry so that there is not a second Holocaust, which it could have been.
Right.
Why is it so hard for us to live with that complexity and the gray mud of what it means to be a sovereignty?
And this is the problem, Rachel. The way I see it is that this is why we are so profoundly divided. I mean, Maimonides, the greatest commentator of the Torah, said that we're supposed to take the golden middle path. This is the way, one of the ways to wisdom is to take that step. And yet people seem to be incapable of sitting in that gray, those 50 shades of it. Okay, so somebody's just written in, if our argument is, why aren't you criticizing Iran or fill in the blank with dozens of other countries that are overly oppressive? That tells you one thing: Israel needs to change how it's acting, because that's not a winning argument. We have to be able to say instead, yep, those who've made decisions in Israel have made lots of decisions I don't agree with, just like in the US. Now, can we move on and partner in our efforts to improve things for X group and Y area situation? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I agree. It's never helpful to say, why aren't you criticizing Iran? My point was Human Rights Watch, not talking about Israel at all. An organization that purports to be about human rights thinks that the worst human rights violator is Israel. Let them, go after any other nation state you want.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Right. So that's my issue there. But I just want to say that the beauty of Israel is that if you read its Declaration of Independence, it remains aspirational.
Yes.
There's nothing about Israel that says we're done. We're a finished project. Everything about Israel is that it remains a laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
It's a laboratory, again, both for the Jewish people and for all of its citizens, even those who aren't Jewish.
I know.
Right. And so our responsibility as people who may not be living in Israel, who choose not to live in Israel, but who deeply care about the safety of Israel, the continued relationship for Jews of diaspora communities with this place, this idea of being part of a collective, our responsibility is to figure out, how do we create individuals who feel this deep passion for this place, who absolutely feel a connection to it, and can be what Michael Walzer calls, which is a connected critic. A connected critic was like the prophets, right? You care about this place so much that you criticize it for the purpose of making it better, not for dismantling it.
Well, that's the criteria, and that's usually the litmus test. Okay, one more question here. How do I discuss the current political view? Oh, wait a second. No. This one, I already read that. Okay. How do we raise grandchildren who are being taught in schools that they are white privileged when they're grandchildren of penniless immigrants who came here not speaking English? Should they continue to feel embarrassed for being white and Jewish, or proud of their heritage that's being dismissed?
Well, of course, I answer on the side of being proud. Proud of their heritage, proud of what their families have overcome, all of the challenges, and what they have traversed in order to be part of a successful nation and a successful people. And successful, I'm not defining in terms of materialism, right? I'm defining in terms of, again, I use the term, if you listened carefully, not you, but everyone, right? Aboriginal. We are an Aboriginal.
We are Aboriginal, yes.
Right? We have an Aboriginal language. And guess what? It's been revitalized, right? We took a language that was used for a biblical purpose and now is able to be used for modern day discourse and some of the most incredible literature. So this is not a place at all that we shouldn't be proud of. At the same time, no one controls what skin color they are born into. So to be ashamed of any skin color is just unacceptable in my mind. I don't care what your skin color is. And also, just because a skin color may be white, to assume that it means that you are something that holds supremacist views, any kind of supremacist views, is highly problematic, highly problematic. And that's where I go back and say, it is our responsibility to encourage ourselves, peers, our friends, to have our children, be able to confidently raise their hand if they're put in a situation and say, I don't understand why that's what you believe and why you think that that's what I have to believe.
Ooh, ooh. I
Right?
don't understand is a very good way especially for a young person, to open up this kind of conversation. I could listen to you all night. I'm going to give you an opportunity now. The last few weeks have been extraordinary. Can you give us your wisdom? You be the prophet for a moment. Tell us what to take from all of this and what you consider a good incremental action step. Momentum as an organization and the trips we take to Israel and the work we do and these boosts that we do are all in an attempt to create this kind of mindfulness, Jewish pride, connection to Israel, and attachment to Jewish values, and most of all, to foster unity without uniformity. What do you suggest, as an expert in this area, would be one simple baby step to take action after this series?
I'm not sure I can give you one.
Okay, give me 10. I'm here for the duration then.
I'm gonna say a few. I grew up in a small town in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. There
Wow.
are very few Jews,
Say.
right? And we understood at a very young age that if we didn't go to shul, there might not be a minyan. And if there's not a minyan, someone can't say Kaddish. And so at a very young age, we had to be able to articulate why it was so important to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And our shul was not 5 minutes away. It was 40 minutes away, right? But we knew that. My parents made that a priority, to something that they gave to each of their children, to say, it is not about you. In an age of this world, me, right? Selfies, that we actually as a people are wired to say it's not about us as individuals, it's the collective.
Mm-hmm.
And feeling part of that at a very young age, whether it's lighting the Shabbos candles every Friday night, whether it's going to shul so that someone can say Kaddish, whether it's making sure that you actually go to Israel and spend time there to engage with the complexity and actually understand, what being Israeli is, that actually meant that we had to actually put our own individualism away.
Wow.
And recognize we're part of something so much bigger. And I would say that has stuck with me. And at the same time, because of where I grew up, I understand what it means to protect minorities deeply, because I understood it was not okay to have a prayer in the public school that was in the name of Jesus. So I understand that sense of responsibility to a minority population. And I feel that that's what's important for us as Jews who don't live in Israel, to be able to help Israelis understand what it means to be a minority as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity where we can learn from each other. And I also really believe that, when you walk through the world with a very clear operating system of Jewishness,
Mm-hmm.
it points you in the direction of wanting to be present for those who need support, but it doesn't mean you need to diminish who you are.
Can you say that again? Say that one more time.
When you walk through the world with the Jewish operating system, it points you in the direction to those who need your support without diminishing who you are.
Oh, you know what? That's going to become a meme. It needs to be. And you know what? I think that that's true on an individual basis, race, religion aside. That, Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, said that love happens in concentric circles. First, you have to have an appropriate relationship with your own self. And then beyond that, your family, and beyond that, your peoplehood, and the entire world, up until every little crawling thing on the ground. but your relationship with the outer circles is directly impacted by your relationship with your inner self. So I think that we have to begin making Jewish choices, supporting and embracing the collective, the community, going back away from the individualism without ignoring what's happening outside of us. And Rachel, I cannot thank you enough. Your presence here, thank you, Rachel, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I also want to thank the Russell Berry Foundation again for sponsoring this amazing series, and to all of you for joining us today. We hope it was as enlightening and educational for you as it was for me. And most importantly, please pass this information along to your loved ones. Try and incorporate it in your life. Like she said, incrementally, small steps, but make Jewish choices. But for me, Adrienne Gold Davis, and all of us in Momentum Land, just remember, as we learn and grow and advocate and identify and make Jewish choices together, the highest form of wisdom will always be kindness. Thank you so much for joining us.